Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories.
We're your hosts, Dr. Caitlinn
And Dr. Randall,
two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us.
The show will cover worldwide mythology, and season 1 will focus on ancient Greek stories,
giving listeners everything they need to know to understand the new Netflix series Chaos.
And most likely several things that they don't. Join us as we talk, laugh, and sing this fall for The Mything Link season 1.
Chaos
Theory. You can link that up. It's appropriately chaotic. This whole situation is appropriately chaotic. Maybe that's it. It's a lesson in chaos. Perfect.
It's a lesson in chaos theory.
Should we get this
show
on the road? Disclaimer, as with all of our episodes so far this season, we are going to discuss content including themes of murder, rape, sexual assault, and just generally the worst parts of humanity. Listener beware.
Surrender all hope, ye who enter here.
But welcome to The Mything Link. I'm Randall.
I'm Caitlinn.
And today we are discussing Hera. And just a really quick note about her name before we get into this. I know, like, in the episodes leading up to this, we've been going back and forth between pronunciations of Hera and Hera. In Chaos, they go with the pronunciation Hera. And in Disney's Hercules, they go with the pronunciation Hera. And in my research, I found that Hera is proper, and it's the same root for the word hero, which we still pronounce that way. So that's an easy way to remember it. So from here on out, we will be, at least I'll be trying my best to remember to say Hera. I've spent a lifetime saying Hera, so I'm doing my best. When we know better, we do better, right?
You don't know what you don't know.
Exactamundo, and we're here to learn. So, who the heck is Hera?
Who the hell is Hera?
Okay, so today we're talking about Hera, the queen of the gods, up on Mount Olympus. So in Chaos, Hera is portrayed by Janet McTeer, and she brings this cold strength to Hera, I think I would identify it as, that I haven't really considered before as part of her character.
Hera is the sister and wife of Zeus. She's the goddess of marriage, childbirth, and women.
And family.
And she was regularly worshipped and prayed to for protection and guidance. At weddings, she was called upon as the protectress of women in childbirth. And her worship was arguably more widespread than Zeus's own because of her influence over marriage, childbirth, and family, which places her squarely in the center of societal stability.
Right. So basically the idea here is even if she was the worst, you can't keep a society running without respecting childbirth at minimum. And as that goddess, which is interesting because there's multiple goddesses of childbirth in ancient Greek mythology. And sometimes Hera is portrayed as the goddess of childbirth, and sometimes she's portrayed as at odds with the goddess of childbirth. So in one story, Hera kidnaps another goddess of childbirth named Eileithyia. She was trying to prevent Apollo and Artemis from being born, more of Zeus's illegitimate children.
Hera as a mother figure, despite that she's the goddess of women, childbirth, family, marriage, she only had a couple of children. I think maybe 4 total.
Oh, yeah. I have them written down right here. Her children are Ares, who is the personification of war. Hebe, the personification of youth. Hephaestus, the personification of fire. Eris, the personification of discord. And Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth.
Right.
Who she has a complicated relationship with.
Right. And arguably like immolated, according to some stories. Is that...
Yeah, not a great situation there for sure, especially for the goddess of motherhood. Ooh.
In the last episode, we talked about Athena emerging fully formed from Zeus's head, which this tracks with who Hera is in every single one of these stories. She's furious that Zeus created a child without her. So she creates Hephaestus on her own, but he's born deformed.
Right, without a father. So she's getting back at Zeus like, oh, you had Athena without me?
Right.
I'll have a Hephaestus without you.
Right. And then she ends up, doesn't she like throw him from Olympus or something? Because she's like, why is he?
Yeah, she's like disgusted and grossed out by him. So it's like that scene in 300 where the Spartans throw the deformed babies off the side of the mountain.
Yep.
Thanks, Hera. God damn it.
In the cultural context, from that perspective, it's an interesting commentary on the female creative and generative power. Like, Zeus is self-sufficient enough and powerful enough that he can birth a whole warrior goddess of wisdom from his head without a woman's involvement. And she's beautiful and wise and, you know, all this stuff. But when Hera creates without Zeus's generative power, the result is subpar. The female creative power is devalued and diminished and seen as unwhole or incapable of creating to the same extent. Like, the female contribution in both of these cases is marginalized and also deeply entangled with the patriarchy, which, just to be clear, at the time, what's the word I'm looking for? Not doctors, but the philosophers who tended to do medical philosophy saw women as deformed men. They were uteruses and vaginas were not functional
like
penises
of the natural form.
Right, exactly. So they were inverted, not as good, all this kind of stuff. And they also, this culture was generally not kind to people of differing abilities, unlike a lot of, you know, I'm thinking of like Yoruba traditions will have like special places of reverences for people with differing abilities because they connect with the divine in a different format. Or the Maori have a really interesting language for talking about autism as a different way of thinking and connecting with the universe and all that stuff. We do not see that with the Greco-Roman society.
So Hera's symbols that she's commonly portrayed with are lions and cattle. And here's something I didn't know, that she is associated with pomegranates. We see in Chaos Hera keeping a ton of bees. I mean, hundreds probably, it shows. And they mention that these bees were all conquests, essentially, of Zeus's that Hera turned into bees. And so that's the nod to the stories like Callisto and Io that we have in classical mythology.
Hera has a penchant for a penchant, isn't that how you always say? A penchant for changing Zeus's victims into some animal or creature.
Right, and it's nice that there's some sort of uniformity in the show. They're all bees, and so you can like actually see the impact of,
and her keeping them in this hive, like they're all in one place
where she can watch them all. Like, I thought that was a really fun touch. I love too that Chaos gives Hera like some agency with her sexuality as well. Sure. That was really nice to see.
Also, when we're seeing that, it's not like she's getting railed. He's like eating her out, right? Like, she's the one getting,
like, she's receiving the pleasure. Yeah, absolutely. That's literally the least he could do.
Yeah, seriously. Right? One of my favorite quotes in the show from Hera is after Dionysus catches her and Poseidon participating in some extracurricular activities. Poseidon tells Hera to leave Zeus, and she says, "This isn't Zeus's house. It's my house, and I belong here." You go, girl.
You go, girl. You go, girl.
Oh, something that I thought was interesting is the scene where Zeus is listening to all the tongues and he hears Hera being pleasured by Poseidon and he starts to devolve. That's where she gives that badass monologue, right? But she also takes that moment to use her feminine allure to distract Zeus from her own infidelity, which I think is really interesting because in the Iliad, Hera has manipulated a lot of things basically to try and make the Trojan War happen the way that she wants and avenge her wounded pride. Zeus at a certain point has forbid the gods from like intervening any further, but Poseidon is going to intervene, and we'll talk more about the Iliad in a few weeks, but she uses her beauty and her feminine wiles to distract Zeus and keep him occupied while Poseidon goes down to the Trojan War to like mess shit up or fix shit or however you want to see it. It's possible in a way to see this as her demonstrating her awareness of her role and an awareness of how to achieve her goals, and her manipulation of Zeus's desires as a form of agency, but it also speaks to how limited her place of power is. She's using indirect means and sexual overtures to achieve her ends. But I thought that was just a really interesting parallel between the show and historical accounts of Hera's behavior. Something else that I think is interesting about the show is the Tacitas. We see in the beginning of the show Eurydice going into the church and asking to speak to the Tacita, who turns out to be her mother. But basically, they're these like silent Hera's priestesses that take confessions but have had their own tongues cut out so they can't relay those confessions. And basically, Hera has just walls and walls of tongues that are speaking ill confessions. In Ovid's Fasti, there's the story of how Zeus is planning to rape this nymph Juturna, and Dea Tacita, she warns the nymph of Zeus's impending violence, and the nymph is able to get away. So Zeus is pretty pissed, and he rips out Dea Tacita's tongue because she informed this nymph of his plan. So that's where we get the name Dea Tacita, which means the silent goddess, if you will. But basically, there's a rite that Ovid talks about where you invoke the Dea Tacita to, quote, seal up hostile mouths and an unfriendly tongue. So basically, you invoke the Dea Tacita to destroy a hated person, which I think is interesting. I think it's interesting that they pulled this specific piece of Roman mythology into the show. For me, I feel like the story of how Hera and Zeus become married is really a necessary place to start with understanding her, because everything that she does, I feel like, stems from this initial trauma that she has with Zeus. Going back to something that you said in the last episode, that Zeus has a pattern. Hera, unfortunately, fits into that pattern that Zeus has. So he's, at a certain point, become obsessed and enamored with his sister, who repeatedly is refusing his advances. No, 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 no. Zeus does not understand that no is a full sentence, that Hera has the right to say no. He doesn't give a shit. So eventually Zeus becomes frustrated that he hasn't been able to tame Hera, if you will. So he creates a thunderstorm and turns himself into a little cuckoo, which is one of the animal symbols of Hera as well. He pretends to be hurt and distressed, and he flies to Hera's bosom for protection. And Hera Hera pities this sad, disheveled, wet little bird and holds it to her chest to keep it warm.
Everything about this is grossing me out right now.
Cue Zeus. He reverts back to his normal human form, and the moment that he does that, and Hera is surprised, he sees that as the opportune moment to grab a hold of her and rape her.
And that's the canon, and that's the canonical story of Zeus and Hera, the king and queen of Mount Olympus.
And the part of this story that just drives the knife further into the heart is that she feels, I could even like tear up. Mm-hmm. She agrees to marry him because she feels ashamed that he's raped her. And that is how Hera became the queen of the gods. I had never heard this story before. And I have my fucking PhD in mythology. All of a sudden, it doesn't excuse Hera's future mistakes, but it does put them into a different framework for us to think about.
Right. It gives us context and insight and fleshes her out as more than just a one-dimensional villainous character.
Right.
Right. It shows us the status of women and the role of women, and this narrative of like, well, look where you are. Like, you should be grateful for the power you have or the position you hold or whatever it is. And here we have a woman who, did she sleep her way to the top? I mean, I guess she was raped and then got placed on the top, right? Again, without her agency, which is just really unfortunate, because then we have story after story of Hera taking agency away from other women because she just doesn't know what else to do with it. She's just continuously lashing out, like Io. Io was turned into a cow, like we explored in several episodes now. Io was turned into a cow, and Hera pestered her continuously with this gadfly and sent her bodyguard, basically Argus, to watch over her and make sure that she never found peace. Like, Hera herself clearly never had any peace, and she took it out on everyone around her. I mean, she's basically like in The Handmaid's Tale. It's very clear that from today's modern perspective, right? Let me be very clear that this is our modern perspective. Hera is a hurt person who hurts people. We want to be very clear that from our cultural context and perspective today, it is not okay to murder people, destroy their lives, put them into situations where things are going to go really poorly, or torture them, or whatever it is, right? Like, again, like we talked about last week with Zeus and Sisyphus, very often with all the gods and goddesses, the punishment does not fit the crime. And Hera is no exception to that. And also our girl gets an extra bad rap. So we're going to have to hold all of these opposing tensions. How many times have we had this conversation recording this damn podcast? Like, all of these things existed once, and we see ourselves reflected in these gods and goddesses. And researching Hera made me feel like that. And it made me feel gross because I was researching for this episode at the same time that I was editing the Zeus episode with you. And I heard myself, oh wait, maybe it was Dionysus episode. I heard our conversation where we were saying, Hera, like, there's a certain point where you just need to leave him. And that felt really victim blamey and gross. And I'd like to redact that statement and say that, Hera, I'm sorry you didn't have the resources and the tools and the emotional support system to escape your abuser. And instead you lashed out at everyone around you, including his other victims. Everyone is a victim here, including Zeus, like we explored last week. It's just a cycle of horror, right? And the buck needs to stop somewhere. And unfortunately, it did not stop with Hera.
No, it did not.
This is hard. This is hard because these goddesses, like, they're literal murderers of like a lot of people, individuals, children, groups of people. And so it's like hard to say that they get a bad rap because they like really did terrible things. And at the same time, Hera is portrayed in such a more negative light than other gods who are traditionally portrayed male, like Zeus and Poseidon. And Hera is a very reactionary goddess. She doesn't seem to be going around causing trouble. She seems to be going around causing trouble in response to perceived slights.
We don't need to get into this in particular, but I strongly identify as a pacifist. I do not think violence is ever the correct answer. And I know that's really easy for me to say as a privileged white woman living in one of the strongest military countries in the globe. Or like, I understand there's context and bias to that. What I would tell my younger students, you're allowed to feel angry. You may not hurt other people with that anger. That's when it becomes wrong, in my opinion.
But I agree, like, the political leaders of our world need to go the fuck back to kindergarten and learn that lesson again.
Right. It's
right?
just...
Hands are not for hitting.
Right. So saying that, the way Hera treats Io is messed up and wrong. The way she treats Callisto is messed up and wrong. The way she treats Heracles is messed up and wrong. The story of Callisto is, I think, a really poignant example of Hera's despicable behavior. It's from Ovid's Metamorphoses. It's a telling of the nymph Callisto, who's a warrior of Artemis, and she is the goddess's favorite nymph. Zeus sees Callisto, lusts after her. Zeus says he doesn't care if it hurts Hera, that the conquest will be worth the possibility of facing Hera's wrath. And so Zeus changes his form into the form of the goddess Artemis to get close to Callisto. And Zeus does the same thing here that he did with Hera. He changes back to his true form, and at a moment when Callisto is surprised, Zeus rapes Callisto.
In Chaos, we see Hera doing this. There's a point in time where Hera approaches a mortal disguised as Zeus and has sex with her, and then the real Zeus comes and you see what happens. And that's interesting that Chaos like flipped this on its head, because we see Zeus doing this over and over and over again, and now it's turning Hera into a rapist. Like, is power worth it when it's the power of the patriarchy and the power to just oppress other people? I would absolutely say no.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Ooh.
So obviously Hera knows. She knows that Zeus has been disloyal, and her rage festers, especially because Callisto has become pregnant by Zeus's rape. And instead of confronting Zeus, Hera channels all of her fury towards the traumatized Callisto. Hera proves herself as emotionally irresponsible and incompetent as Zeus is.
Well, they're brother and sister.
They are brother and sister. Hera doesn't care that Zeus is the one that's raped Callisto, that it was Zeus who tricked the nymph and forced himself upon her, that Callisto did not have any choice.
And I'd like to be very clear that the text is clear that Zeus is a creeper and a rapist.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just a modern lens, at least in this translation. It's specifically, I'm in book 2 here.
No matter how hard she fought, she couldn't get away, is something Ovid repeatedly says in the translation Randall's reading.
No sooner had he seen the weary girl alone, defenseless, than Jove told himself, this turn is one my wife won't learn about. So I just want to be very clear that the actual source text, this isn't something that we're extrapolating. This isn't something where we're reading between the lines. It legitimately says in the cultural context of ancient Greece, this nymph was attacked by Zeus. So very clear.
Basically, Hera just discards the truth and cruelly enacts her anger. She's hurt, so she's going to hurt other people. And she physically attacks Callisto, just like Zeus physically attacked Callisto. Two different kinds of attack, but attack nonetheless. And the text that Randall's reading literally says that Hera grabs Callisto by her hair and pulls her to the ground, while Callisto has her arms outstretched and is imploring pity of the goddess. But physically assaulting the nymph is not enough. Hera transforms Callisto into a bear, and so now her cries are coming out as moans and growls and these horrible wailing sounds. So not only does Hera destroy Callisto's beauty, she distorts it and deforms it into something monstrous. Eventually, Zeus places the form of Callisto and her son among the stars. So that's the Ursa Major and Minor, the bears in the sky. Hera interprets this as Zeus insulting her, and it just can't. There's no justification for her behavior. At the end of the day, it is not okay for Hera to treat Callisto the way that she does.
Yeah, it's the abused woman who's furious that, I'm here, I'm showing up, I'm doing everything, I'm cleaning up your messes, and you still won't fucking pick me. Right. You still won't choose me. I'm still not enough. I mean, any person who has been trapped in an abuse cycle with a partner like Zeus knows that refrain very well. How could I do all of this and I am still not enough for you? Mm-hmm. And it's horrid. It's so sad and it's so tragic. And that's what makes it a cycle, is it continues and it continues and it continues until it is intentionally broken. And maybe maybe that's part of this magic of mythology, the way that we're reinterpreting these stories, because we want our queen to be strong and powerful, not because she has been destroyed and must be. There are so many more empowering ways to tell stories of why a woman would be protecting of her marriage and her family and her home. And we can absolutely tell those stories. And I don't know if Hera can be, when we get to our Medusa episode, we'll see how a character can be reinterpreted, but Hera, it might just run too deep. Like, to me, she's the wives in The Handmaid's Tale. She's the slave master's wives, right? Like, their proximity to power allows them to create victims out of their victimhood. And it is fucking horrific. And it is not an excuse to be an abusive piece of shit. It doesn't, regardless of your gender, right? And these cycles just need to be broken because they keep happening. It, like Caitlin said earlier, it definitely is different, and it's a symptom of the patriarchy that we even have a figure like this where her main identification is that she's pissed off at her husband. Like, she's the original nagging wife. Ugh, I hate it. I want to make sure that we acknowledge that Hera is by far not the only figure in Greek mythology to behave this poorly.
Right.
And not even the worst one. Greek mythology is complicated and it's messy and it is gross. But you know what? Like, death and anger and retribution and wrath and, unfortunately, abuse and sexual assault, like, all of these things are part of the human experience as well. And Hera serves as a reminder of what it looks like when people are treated this way, when they have no other options. There's no room for them to be nice. There's no geniality. There's little to no empathy for the victims and the people around her. And I think it's a really important reminder, just an important piece of her story that I think tends to kind of fall between the cracks, where we just see her as the villain.
She's both. She is villain and victim, and or all, I guess, villain, victim, and
get you a gal who can do it all. And yes, and
Hera is complicated. She's the goddess of marriage who's married to a serial rapist and serial adulterer. She's the guardian.
As one of his victims.
She's the guardian of marital relationships, and yet is constantly insulted, belittled, and disempowered by her own. She's a victim who lashes out and punishes other victims. She's a strong, independent woman who, by nature of her divinity and symbolic position, upholds the institution of patriarchy and hierarchical monogamous marriage. She simultaneously holds this intense tension between women's inherent power and their societal limitations, and she exercises the power that she has in the way that she knows how. And in so many of these stories, she's portrayed as angry, vindictive, violent, selfish, full of wrath and rage. She's a bitch who punishes the victims of her husband as if they already haven't been punished enough. And I want to almost choose to see Hera's rage and even her destructive tendencies as a protest against her disempowerment or the violations to her dignity. Right, she's maneuvering within the limitations imposed on her by asserting her will and challenging Zeus's authority. Of course, she does this at the expense of other people, which isn't okay at all. So then that, I think, challenges us to ask as women especially, how do we want to negotiate power and exercise autonomy and authority within patriarchal systems? In a lot of ways, the Greek goddesses share the oppression of mortal women, both ancient and modern. They have the same emotional complexities that you and I have. So how do I want to do it? I don't want to be like Hera. I don't want to hurt other victims because I've been victimized. That's not okay. That's never okay.
Right. And that's the thing. She was never actually, okay, that's not fair to say. She did actually go after Zeus several times and was powerless, essentially, against him. There's a story where Hera tried to get the other gods to join in a rebellion against Zeus, and she was unsuccessful. And in retaliation, Zeus chained her to the sky and left her up there and only took her down after she had been weeping all night. It's absolutely awful. And so what we see is her only attacking successfully victims who she could exert power over, right? Who are lesser than her. She turns around and bullies the people who she could actually bully instead of going after the people who are in power, who are actually perpetrating the action against her. And it's really, really tragic. I mean, there's stories of her attacking babies and trying to murder babies. And we see this in Chaos. She doesn't do the dirty work herself. She has Zeus do it for her.
Chaos really hits the nail on the head when it comes to portraying her as the abused who's become the abuser. You see the complicated relationship that she has with Zeus, and you almost feel his rage building towards her in the show. And at the same time, she's delighting in the suffering of other people. And I have to wonder if it's because it detracts from her own, like makes her feel more powerful. In the show, you see her reveling in the confession of the tongues.
Like we talked about last week, like misery loves company. Like she's creating a level of misery around her that makes her feel superior. And we want to acknowledge that in Chaos, they don't go into Hera's past.
Right.
They don't necessarily make her out to be as big of a villain as classical mythology has made her out to be.
Sure.
They show her as pretty equal in power to Zeus, definitely superior in intellect to both Zeus and Poseidon, I would say, in her portrayal in the show. And we definitely see how her character has been updated to reflect a bit more modern values for us to find more empathy and connection with her as a character than just this tragic figure of classical mythology.
Hera is interesting for her complexities to me, but also weirdly enough, because I was just bragging about how good I am at holding the tensions, she's also really hard for me to hold the like I desperately want to reclaim her and to see her in a different light, because I know powerful women are demonized by patriarchal societies. History has told the stories of women, of strong women. I think of Jezebel in the Bible. Sorry to diverge here, but she's one of the most hated, reviled women in the entirety of Christianity, right? Like,
yes, and I portrayed her in a play in 7th grade at my Lutheran middle school.
Were you a harlot?
I was chosen to play Jezebel.
I knew I loved you.
And then I wasn't invited back for 8th grade. So what do you do?
Oh no. It's
Friggin'
they felt threatened by your thespian skill at playing Jezebel.
Knew it.
She's like, honestly, to me, one of the most, I think arguably my favorite biblical character.
Tell me more.
For thousands of years, we have told her story over and over and over again in a way that makes her sound like this sadistic whore who was out to get the godly men and bring the downfall of the Christian God. And the reality is, historically, Jezebel was the most peaceful queen that Israel ever had. She brought trade routes. She brought prosperity to Israel. She was the super well-educated princess from a pacifistic island. They believed in trade more than they believed in war. They believed in making connections over tearing them down. And that's...
Was she the princess of Atlantis?
No.
You said she's a pacifist island who believes in like trade and peace over war. It sounds like Atlantis.
I mean, I guess so. It's Tyre, the island of Tyre, Sidon. She was revered. She would have been held in extreme high esteem by her people. All this to say, what she basically brought was polyamory to Israel. And they were like, fuck no. Like, I'm trying to get around to the fact that historically, Jezebel was actually a really remarkable figure. She brought peace and prosperity, and you don't see any of that in the Bible. You don't hear that when racist people call women of color that name. That's not what you're hearing. What you're hearing is thousands of years of patriarchal Christians telling you over and over and over again that this woman was horrible. And that's what I want to see in Hera. I want to feel tenderness that I feel towards Jezebel for having her story retold so connivingly and intentionally for so long. And it to me, it just shows that women, even supreme goddesses, are subjected to patriarchy. And I think, how many times have I been called a bitch for calling out somebody's bullshit? How many times have I been called a bully for setting a boundary? How many times have I been called horrible, horrible things, even by other women, for standing up for myself or taking care of myself in the way that I need to? When other gods do these things, when they punish victims or torture mortals, it's a lesson. When other stories mythically teach us why gadflies are in the eyes of cows, it's sense-making. But when Hera does it, when it's her who catalyzes the story of why peacocks have eyeballs in their ass feathers, she's a psychotic animal. Portraying her as the scorned petty wife is a political move, in my opinion, by the patriarchy. Same as it is today. Her power, which is arguably more influential and prevalent than Zeus, threatens the male-dominated structure of Greco-Roman society and Greco-Roman mythology at the same time. So what do men who are terrified of losing their power do when they feel it slipping through their fingers? They call women emotional, unstable, demote her from the divine feminine to batshit crazy, and gaslight her. And I think it speaks to, like, I've definitely lashed out at other people because I've been a victim, right? Like, I've wanted to reclaim my power in ways that have resulted in me being verbally violent to other people.
Absolutely. And it depends on who's telling our story, right? Like all great mythologies, like we've discussed, the story depends on who's telling it and who's receiving it. And if I went up to the ex-girlfriend of a guy I was currently dating, that would be a very specific conversation about who that guy is and what he's about, right? Like, just because of the context of that conversation and who's involved in it. And the conversation about that same guy between his mom and third grade teacher is going to be a completely different story, right? Though, right. Like, and all of these stories can be contradictory and can be true about the same person. And all of those opposites are being held in tension at all times. And the same is true here. I know that if some people I've dated or people I'm no longer friends with, the stories that they would tell about who I am and what I'm about, I don't have any control over that. And they are probably not the same stories I would tell about myself. And they're not the same stories that the people who love me would tell about me, right? Like, and all of these things are true at once, unfortunately. Sure. And unfortunately as well, like, the more we have language to identify what abuse is and what emotional abuse is, and I think it's rare to find a person who hasn't been both a victim and a perpetrator of emotional or verbal abuse, right? Especially as we're, so many of us, myself included, I'm on this like healing journey, right? Where as millennials, we're learning how to talk about our feelings and we're going to therapy and we're learning new structures through which to see the world and through which to see ourselves and new ways to understand all of these things. And it feels really important, and it's difficult work, and healing is nonlinear and it's circuitous. And oftentimes we yell at the people we love the most, or we show the worst parts of ourselves to the people we trust the most. And I don't know if we can use that to explain. We could certainly use it to explain Hera's behavior, but it's not an excuse, right? Like, and without a redemption story of Hera actively like apologizing and making reparations to all of these people who she hurt, I don't know. I would love to see a redemption story of Hera, like a recovery program, like we see with AA or NA. There's a step where You have to not only admit that you have a problem, but you have to actively go and make amends with the people who you've hurt.
Right.
Before you acknowledged what the problem was and understood, right? That's part of the healing journey. That's part of the hero's journey. And shit, Hera is where we get the word hero, this protectress. Like, I want to see that. I want to see her complete Hera's journey where she's making amends and figuring out how to make things right. Right. And we see that she has love inside her and reverence. And I know it's hard to say that we see it in the story of Io, and because we don't see it for Io, we don't see it for Zeus, we don't see it for who you would think that we would want to see it for. But Hera sends her guard Argus to be her eyes, essentially, and he famously has 100 eyes, and he ends up through the course of Io's story getting unalived. And in her mourning, like, even as the queen of Mount Olympus, she can't bring anyone back to life, but in her mourning, she creates the peacock in honor of Argus, and in the peacock's feathers you can see his eyes, and that reminds her of him. So you see this tenderness that she has, you see this love she has for a lateral relationship it's not even a lateral relationship. Her guard is employed by her and works for her. Poor thing, probably doesn't have any equals. She has her siblings who are abusing her actively and raping her. I just wanted to give a nod to Chaos for having peacocks roaming the grounds at their palace, their compound on Mount Olympus. Their
80s whorehouse. Yeah. Their 80s drug den.
Yep. And
also, she's not nice to her actual children either.
Yeah, no, she's not. Well, how can she have anything nice in her body after this lifetime? She was born and immediately got gobbled up by her father and spent God knows how much time rumbling around in his belly before Zeus rescued her. And then she had to fight with Zeus against her father and everything she's ever known to completely change the world. And then they settled on the top of this mountain where she just got raped by her brother, who she thought she was helping. And now she realizes she's trapped in this marriage where she either needs to be continuously raped by her brother, or she just needs to accept it and channel her rage in other directions. And that's what she ends up doing because she's so fucking powerless. Like, this fucking woman, this goddess, like, she has no autonomy. We can't separate her from the context of the life that she's lived. And this is a life of trauma. I mean, for fuck's sake, this origin story is more traumatic than Batman's or the Joker's or whatever, right? I'm serious. This is for real.
Sorry, I love that.
They have an excuse to go around bombing buildings or doing whatever bullshit. I mean, look at freaking Two-Face. Like, that's his only trauma, is like half his face looks bad. Wah. And like, now, come on, come the fuck on. I mean, Hera's like Poison Ivy, portrayed as evil, but absolute.
Is she the reason why so many of us are bi Poison Ivy?
If I was bi, I'd be bi for Poison Ivy.
Yeah.
I have multiple Poison Ivy costumes. I know. How am I straight?
I don't know.
This is a case for the FBI.
When I would describe my type of woman, it would be like a red-haired woman with straight across bangs, and I just always think Poison Ivy.
I never wanted to be with her. I wanted to be her. How many years have I spent dyeing my hair red? And it's not just Poison Ivy. I mean, all of my heroes were redheads. Pippi Longstocking, Anne of Green Gables, The Little Mermaid, Poison Ivy, like all of them.
Did you ever watch the Mary Queen of Scots movie with Saoirse Ronan and Margot Robbie? No. I watched that on my way to Chris Downing's gender class. And that was like a moment where I was like, I think I really am a little gay.
Let's see. The people I would be gay for, they don't make me horny, but I want to be them. So I'm assuming that's like the closest I'm getting to being attracted to women. I wish I was them. Is absolutely Evie from The Mummy.
Oh, obviously.
100%. as I was researching Hera, I was feeling like she has such an association with Oshun. And of course, you know, Oshun is the West African goddess of childbirth, women, marriage, like very Hera parallel. And she also has tales of wrath and completely losing her shit. And she is framed so differently than Hera is.
Yes.
Like we connected Hera and Oshun as similar goddesses who represent similar things. They're certainly treated differently by their society. And we see this difference played out in multiple ways of society, where in the West African Yoruba cultural context, the feminine divine is seen as something that is holy and divine and is existing in tension and opposition at the same time in a lateral sense with the divine male. And in the Greek tradition, we don't see that. We see the divine female oftentimes as lesser than or subject to the will of the men or whatever that is. And we see this, that's such an important thing that mythology shows us, is what a lot of the social roles and the structure of gender roles and those types of things, how they would have been in that society for these stories to be told the way that they're told.
Absolutely.
How would we work on like rehabilitating Hera? What would it take for her to be redeemed in your eyes? I feel like you view her with kinder eyes than I do right now. I feel like you're still really celebrating her, which is fine. That wasn't a judgment, like a value judgment. I was just saying, like, I think I have a further to go. I think we have to be fair if we're giving Zeus the treatment that it's not okay to have the king of the gods behaving that. Not okay. Right. What a fucking value judgment I'm participating in right now. But when you have the head figure, the king of the gods and the queen of the gods who are behaving this way, it stands to reason that that's giving permission for people in society to behave that way. And I know that I don't want to live in a society like that. That doesn't align with my values. And I'm having a really hard time finding redemption for Hera. Right. And also, like, I can't separate myself and my story and my childhood and my life experiences from these myths. I need to see her do something to redeem herself before I can restructure this. Because like for the Io story, for example, I could get behind her sending Argus to watch Io to see if Zeus is lying or not. Because she'll never know if she follows Zeus. I can restructure that, like, okay, a little bit insane behavior, because like me, from my privileged perspective, who could just say, just leave, girl, he's driving you insane. Like, poor thing doesn't know anything else, right? Her whole life, she's been imprisoned, like in Kronos, in a relationship with Zeus, and stuck in this role now where she doesn't know how to behave in healthy relationship with others. She has so much work to do. I don't know how I'm going to give Hera a pass. I am a person who's been the victim of a Hera or two in my lifetime. And I am on a journey of not turning into Hera myself. Yes. And that is what is so powerful for me in her story. Yes. And that is why I think that she doesn't deserve a redemption and she doesn't deserve a resolution, because she exists as a Greek tragedy to show us what happens to women under this system. Exactly. And this is not where I thought this conversation was going to go today at all. No, me either. I was not prepared for this in any way, shape, or form. No, this is the magic of ADHD, folks. Yeah, the reason, I mean, I've also been the victim of a Hera, and I've worked all of my cognizant adult life to not become her, to not be Hera, to not use my victimhood as a reason to alienate other people. And I think about this a lot because I've done so much work to hold all the tensions and like look at it from a different view. I understand why my Hera, she was just perpetuating the cycle, right? She didn't have the tools or the knowledge to act any differently towards us than she did. However, that does not excuse her behavior. That does not mean I forgive her. That does not mean she gets to move forward with me. No, opposite. 100%. 100%. At all. I don't want to have
more grace for her than she deserves.
Well, and I don't know if grace is the right word. I think we mourn.
Yes.
We mourn the opportunity she never had access to.
Yes.
And we acknowledge the woman she was never able to become. And we acknowledge that it was the patriarchy that held her back. And I mean, essentially thank her for her service.
Right. And so I actually had written in my notes, because I desperately, like, I'm like a feminist through and through. That's where my tenderness comes from for Hera, is like just from a feminist standpoint. Like, I have studied the system of patriarchy in Greco-Roman society extensively, to a point where I desperately want to give any woman the benefit of the doubt. And still, I wrote in my notes, Hera is not the feminist icon we need. She is not the example that I want. She is not the example that women should have. She is...
I mean, she's the tragic example of what happens to women under the patriarchy.
Sure.
Like, that's what she is.
So I don't know if, in my mind, there's no outcome where she gets a pass. There's no outcome where she becomes a role model.
I mean, she's a cautionary tale.
Right.
And we can look at her with kind eyes, I think, as feminists, like through the feminist perspective and through like the lens of wanting to deconstruct the patriarchy. We could see her as a victim. And we can also see her victims as well. Right. Like, all of those things are true.
The story of Zeus tricking Hera into marriage, I think, is, I mean, really triggering for me on a number of levels, just because my own lived experience, right? But I think I see, like, my tenderness for her from like a feminist perspective comes from this moment, because I have been able to become a better person. I don't like the way that I'm phrasing this. I actively did not want to become Hera, and I still don't. And I think I, like, exactly like you said, I mourn who she was and who she could have been, and I mourn who she did become. You know, it's truly a tragedy.
She's a tragic figure in every sense of the word, and I don't think that's how her story is commonly told at all. She's seen as a villain, and I see nothing but tragedy over and over and over again.
Something else, though, that I was thinking about too, especially as we're talking about this, like, Hera is so alone. Like, even Argus, who you're talking about, is employed by her. She, you know, you and I heal and are healing because we have each other. And I'm not going to fucking let you turn into this. There's no way in hell. And you're not going to let that happen to me either, right? Like,
right. And that's what we see, these crones on the verges of society. And I mean, Hera's at the center of it all, but I'm thinking of Ursula from The Little Mermaid. I'm thinking of every hag and witch and whoever is demonized and villainized just because they're stuck in this cycle too. Right. Everybody's stuck here, man.
It's true.
And that's why the patriarchy, that's why the structures, the oppressive structures in power, whether it's race or gender or fill in the blank, there is power in keeping people separated.
Right.
Right. Let's just look at this from as little of a political context as possible. Let's look at this from like working. There's a office culture in America that says you don't talk about your salary with other people. It's rude to talk about your salary. And now there are actively laws being passed in multiple states that salary ranges have to be made public when a job is being advertised or recruited for, or whatever the case may be. And the lack of communication of that information only serves the people who are underpaying other people, right? There's power in community. There's power in conversation. There's power in support network for each other. And loneliness is an epidemic, and it's terrible. And like, that's something that me personally in my life, I've been working on building strong community locally where I live, because I have so many beautiful humans in my life, like Caitlinn, like my best friends from growing up, and we're all spread around the country. And that's a tragedy in itself, that we have the ability to form such strong communal bonds with people who live far away. And that's a tension that exists for me too,
Yeah.
you know?
Something that, man, I'm like super emotional today. Something that you said to me a few maybe months ago now was that I think about this like almost every day, is this is how we heal together. Just that super simple statement. And it's true. Like, this is, you heal me. You have, and you keep doing it. And I feel sad that Hera never got that, sure. But at the end of the day, like, I read her stories and I'm glad.
To know what it looks like to not be in community with other women, to not have the support. She didn't have mom, she didn't have aunts, she didn't have extended networks. She had nothing. She was by herself,
right?
Going from an abusive home to an abusive marriage. And that's the reality of so many people. And yeah, healing happens together, and you heal me every day as well. And doing this together, having a reason to dive into these stories
and be together.
The way we spend our days is the way we spend our life.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode of The Missing Link.
That's not what we're called.
R.I.P. Your turn. I quit.
All right. Thanks for joining us this week on The Missing Link. It was so fun exploring Hera. Next week is going to be a mother. Hera. Next week is going to be a really special week because Caitlin and I are going to be recording together in person. Caitlin is coming to San Diego,
and
it's going to be very, very fun. So we're going to be recording together in person.
The world isn't ready for it.
They're not. And we're going to be recording on Orpheus and Eurydice. And there is going to be a couple special treats next week. There might be musical breaks. And there's definitely going to be a special guest. Dr. Deborah Crossland is going to be joining us, and she's going to be talking about her book, The Quiet Part Out Loud. It is a YA novel based on the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. And she's also a mythologist, a teacher, a professor, and we are very excited to have her on and to talk to her about Orpheus and Eurydice.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye. Okay, bye.
Bye, love you, bye.
Bye, love you, bye.
Thanks for listening to The Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall Ulyate and Caitlinn Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlinn Curry. With music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernweh Collective, Incorporated, a humanities nonprofit based in San Diego, California. As a small nonprofit, we appreciate if you have the time to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow our audience. For more information on our organization, head over to fernwehcollective.org. Thanks for listening.
I like it holding it in my hands. That's what she said.
We both just stare at each other. We both just look up and stare at each other. For goodness sake.